Då drar vi igång hörni. Jag kommer börja prata lite grann på svenska och sen kommer jag hälsa våran engelska gäst välkommen. Jag heter Herdy och jag är chefredaktör på Tidningen Flamman. En mycket gammal tidning, 110 år har vi blivit, 111 i år faktiskt. Och vi har precis den här hösten samlat in pengar för att kunna bygga vår egna podd- och tv-studio. Och många av er som sitter här har hjälpt till med det, för det är vi evigt tacksamma. Och för att vi ska kunna göra det bästa av den här videon, den här studion, och för att vi ska kunna bygga en progressiv och radikal medieplattform som är det Flamman vill bli, så har vi bjudit in Aaron Bastani som är en av grundarna till en plattform som vi har tittat väldigt mycket på, som heter Novara Media. Och det här samtalet kommer gå ut på att jag pratar med Aaron och ställer olika frågor och försöker mjölka honom på så mycket information som möjligt om hur det har fungerat för Novara. Very much welcome to you, Aaron Bastani. And we are so very glad to have you here. And I just told the people here that Flamman has always, since you started, looked to your platform and want to learn about how to do what you do here in Sweden. So first off, could you explain to us what Novara Media is?
Okay. So briefly, it's a multimedia platform. It's on articles, videos, podcasts. But then I think what's probably more important and salient for a Swedish audience is what was it a response to? And it was a response to a changed political context after 2010 in particular. So the growth of austerity, a generation of younger people who realised there wasn't really a future under the system, which has become more and more clear, particularly in last week's budget. We'll talk about that later on maybe. And so the immediate context was young people. I was starting my PhD, others starting their PhDs, graduate degrees, undergraduate degrees. And we came out of the student movement around tuition fees going up, and that failed. And at the time, the Labour Party was a neoliberal party. Because of our electoral system, no new parties could emerge, other than obviously ones that are geographically confined, like the Scottish National Party. So we thought, what could we do? How do we change the political conversation? And we decided a media platform was the best way to do it. So that's what Novara is. It's an intervention in what we view as a terminal crisis of capitalism, and as well, which is again important for you guys, a cultural war. So we wanted to create really a pole of attraction around a set of ideas, and initially we weren't thinking to persuade millions of people, but at least try and change the ideas of activists. So if we had a good audience of 50,000 people and we could influence them, then we thought that was more than enough.
That's very interesting, and I would like you, before we go into all the very interesting stuff you have been doing, maybe you could talk a bit about your background and what you did before Novara Media.
So I started a PhD in 2010. I finished it in 2015 in new media and activism around some of this stuff. And over the intervening period, I also did Novara Media. Prior to that, I did public policy, was in think tanks. I was a soft left, we call it in Britain, And then after 2008, it was clear that something had changed. And we had a Labour government at the time, and we nationalised some banks. We had some demos, and the general impression was that we would now have a social democratic government. Gordon Brown would go well to the left of Tony Blair. And that never happened. So for me, politically, I got interested in a whole new range of left-wing ideas. I then left policy, went into the academy, finished the PhD, still doing Novara, and I'm currently writing a book, which is called? It's going to be called Fully Automated Luxury Communism. So that's out in June.
Yeah.
And then once I finish the book, I'll have to get a part-time job with some MP or something. Right.
Someone's got to do the job. You have already been into this, but how did you start up Novara Media? But maybe you could talk a bit about how you did actually do it.
Okay, so initially it was just a radio show on Resonance FM, which is a London-wide radio station on FM frequency. So similar to Stockholm, regional radio here is going to be quite a big audience. And it was a weekly show. And then we thought, well, let's turn this into a podcast. And then because we were activists and some of us had relatively large Twitter profiles, it sort of snowballed from there. So somebody said, hey, I can help you make video, I can help you build a website. So it was very serendipitous. And we never had this vision for it being X, Y, or Z. It was very serendipitous in English, fortunate. Very, nobody planned it. So it was mostly by chance. And it was informed by our values. And just primarily really the absence of anything like it in the mainstream media. So if it wasn't us, it would have been somebody else. I really believe it is other people, right? This is not just Novara that's doing this in the UK. So yeah, it was good fortune, young people, access to resources, intellectual capital, social media capital.
But we have the big problem with money. Maybe you can tell us a bit about how you went about getting funding and finding writers, and how was it just luck or?
Yeah. So obviously money is hugely important. Britain, it's much harder than Sweden because you have the remnants of a social democratic state. We don't. So we recognised the fact that we had to pay our contributors as quickly as possible, our writers as quickly as possible. They're all paid. We have 2 staff members now. We have a studio. Where's the money come from? It was basically through a subscriber model. And we said, you don't get anything new. There's no exclusive, content for people that subscribe. But if you want to help us amplify this politics, take it to the forefront of the national conversation, then, just give us £5 a month. And that's not just limited to what we do. It's actually been done far more successfully in the US. There's a podcast called Chapo Trap House. They get $70,000 a month, right? The Young Turks have raised millions of dollars, the most popular political YouTube channel. Now, you could argue, this is a problem for Swedes, that they've got so much money, we've got so much money because our problems are so big. The people are desperate. So maybe in Sweden there's not necessarily the urge to fund alternative or radical left media like there would be in the US. Nonetheless, I think there's certainly a template there for anybody to try and imitate.
Yeah, and we tried to do that with this building of the studio, and you all gave us a lot of money. So yeah, that's it works even here. How did you define Novara's politics when it began, and has it changed over the years? How did you focus your politics and your everything?
So we're all Marxists. None of us come from old left Trotskyist traditions. None of us come from Stalinist background. We were just, I suppose, radical socialists who, again, it's about what's happened after the crisis. And I think it's particularly big. I can't speak about the Swedish context. It's particularly big in Britain and the US. You see it in a few other European countries as well, is that people have just gravitated towards the ideas of Karl Marx. Now, why is that? It's because all of a sudden you have somebody who can explain the crisis of capitalism pretty well. So you're wondering, in Britain, for instance, the data is phenomenal. Real wages have fallen by about 12% since 2008. So that's wages indexed with inflation. They've fallen by 12%. And then the Treasury says this week they're going to fall for the next decade as well. So it's 20 years of falling wages. Productivity is falling. GDP growth per head really going nowhere, right? And so if you're looking for a theorist who makes sense of that, he's very useful. Okay, nobody has all the answers, but he's certainly more useful than Milton Friedman or Frederick Hayek, or if you're an economist, you're a graduate student economist or a PhD, or you do an economics module, the stuff you're being taught doesn't make any sense. And I don't necessarily before I call myself a Marxist, I call myself an empiricist, because I'm a social scientist. I believe in, empiricism and facts. And so for me, that's why I say Marxism is such a key part of my politics. And that's broadly the same for all of us. So even though we call ourselves Marxists, we don't necessarily associate with the historical organising traditions of Marxism.
And has it changed over the years, or is it? Are you the same? Do you have the same policies now, and promote the same policies now that you did in 2010, 11?
I would say that we're libertarian leftists, which is to say we have a massive respect for the state, but we're also quite critical of it in regard to policing, British foreign policy, etc., etc. Has it changed? Our position regards the state has obviously massively changed since Labour, and there was an ambivalence towards state power in Britain, and just the impossibility of a radical left party, because you've got the Labour Party since the 1920s telling you it's not possible. But obviously with the election of Jeremy Corbyn, I said he could never be the leader of the Labour Party. I said it's impossible. It's simply not possible. And if he was to win, then he would be the most radical leader of the Labour Party since arguably George Lansbury, probably ever, right? It's impossible. It's not going to happen. So that's why he was a 200-to-1 shot. So I didn't think it was plausible that he would win that. So now the fact that the guy's the favourite to be the Prime Minister, naturally we're going to change our position regarding the possibility of the far left taking state power. So the key question for us is, what do we do with taking state power? And so these are very important debates at the moment on the British left. So for instance, Paul Mason wants to keep Trident. He says we should keep nuclear weapons, which is a very divisive issue. But his point is that the first term should be about economic reforms, smashing neoliberalism, and then foreign policy, defence is a second term thing. You can't take on the economics establishment and the military establishment all at the same time, because they're going to try and swamp you anyway. So these are the debates we're currently having, and we're trying to be ahead of the curve in regard to what happens when Labour in power.
We're going to talk more about the Labour Party and Corbyn and such, but I'm interested in also what kind of criticism do you usually get from other leftists? For example, our paper is sometimes told by older leftists or earlier generation of left activists that we focus too much on identity politics. Is that something you can recognize?
Yeah, I have the misfortune of being a native English speaker. So we have imported some of the worst aspects of American anarchism, which is not good. That said, I think the binary is a bit silly. Because again, if we're talking as Marxists, you have the base, you have the superstructure, and clearly culture is an expression of economic relations. So you can't ignore cultural relations, okay? At the same time, you can't reduce them to merely, the appendage of economic relations. And for us, communism, and maybe that's a dirty word in Sweden, socialism, is about the liberation of all of us as individuals and as a society. And that means that everybody has the resources, the safety, the means to be who they want to be. And that means education, that means healthcare, that means housing. They shouldn't be commodities. But it also means, look, if you want to be a woman and have a relationship with a woman, or if you want to be trans or whatever, it's irrelevant, it's immaterial, you're a human being. So for me, that binary doesn't make sense. And actually, if you want to build a social majority, it has to encompass both the economic aspect, but also the identity one. But I think that the idea of identity politics is silly because, the American founding fathers said, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And the point is, as socialists, is that we say that's entirely right. The point is that liberalism and capitalist social relations can't make possible the pursuit of happiness, right? But that doesn't mean it's irrelevant.
Very good answer. I will frame it and put it on my office. And what is Novara's relationship with other media platforms like? I think maybe you should also explain a bit about the media sphere in Great Britain, because we don't have the same here, really, of this very polarized media situation. We have a polarized, the trolls and the avpixlat, you all know what I mean. We have those, but maybe you can talk about some of the other media issues in the UK and how that has changed over the years.
Mm-hmm. So in Britain, the BBC is incredibly dominant. The BBC has about 70% of radio news market, 75% of broadcast news market. And then in print, you have the complete opposite. You have a bunch of privately owned, tax-dodging newspapers. The people that own them don't even live in Britain. So it's a strange sort of public service broadcasting, monopolistic, but not necessarily in a bad way. And then this, like, just, I think, probably the worst print media
in the world.
In the world, yeah. Right? And it's interesting because in the 2015 general election, only the Daily Mirror backs Labour, right? Only one newspaper. I mean, The Guardian were ambivalent. They backed the Lib Dems in 2010. So it's like a strange moment where only one national newspaper backs the centre-left party. And even in the US, I don't know who here is familiar with the Nairn-Anderson thesis. The Nairn-Anderson, really? Because Britain was the first country to industrialise, its bourgeoisie is incapable of understanding its own interests. Okay? They're not actually like a proper bourgeoisie, they're really thick. So whereas the American bourgeoisie understand that Hillary was preferable to Trump, the New York Times would never call Hillary Clinton a Marxist. In London, the Times of London will call Ed Miliband a Marxist. And they believe it. They really, they're not just being, silly, they really, really believe it. So in print we have a strange media and also in broadcast. And what we try to do is, first and foremost, we've had to say, we're offering ideas that nobody else is offering, and in an intelligent and funny and interesting way. And we've had to make a niche for ourselves. So just from where we came from, that was young people in major urban areas. And then it's obviously grown from there. But they feel like an underserved audience anyway. So that's always a good place to start. And then in terms of our relationship to the rest of the media is we just tend to attack them, which is politically a wise thing to do. It's rigged system, establishment, and so on and so forth. And obviously it has the benefit of being true. So, yeah.
But you also get invited to different kind of shows, and how do you do that?
I think, if you're a producer and you've got somebody who can be relatively confident, and we had Ash Sarkar, one of our editors, she was on BBC This Week a few days ago with Michael Portillo, and she said, "You've lost it, you're an idiot," this ex-defence minister, with his hair slicked back. And if you're a producer, it makes very good television. The point is she looks the part, she sounds the part. So you can do it, you just need a profile. And our benefit is the establishment media in Britain now says, look, there's this huge voter cohort, especially amongst the young, who feel entirely unrepresented. How do we represent them? Which in itself is problematic. And even if only 1 in 50 of those people have heard of Novara Media, there's not many people they can take off the shelf. So in this country, let's say if the left had a surge in 2 years' time, they double their vote, and they say it's coming from ethnic minorities, older women and the young. Then they'll be like, well, who represents these demographics, as a media outlet?
Very, very good. And you have written on the novaramedia.com that Novara is supposed to be a part of a political action. Can you talk a bit about that?
We don't really view ourselves as journalists, or we do, but we're politically committed. And we think that all journalists are politically committed. It's just that some aren't honest about it. They're not honest about their political commitments. So we think that the best thing to do is just, the Daily Mail, Peter Hitchin should say, I believe this. Which incidentally, he said that as well. He said that all journalists should just be honest about their commitments. So we try and not just cover the news, but also create collective action as well. So we'll see, go to this protest or do this or whatever. Because we don't see the two as distinct.
But how do you decide which political movement to cover or support or feed into?
Individuals can, broadly speaking, do what they like within the editorial team. But then we have meetings and we'll talk about what do we think our position is on this. So with Brexit, for instance, I was for Brexit. I think the European Union's a bad thing. And then obviously colleagues of mine disagreed, which I'm sure is probably a similar dynamic in Sweden. And there are very good arguments for either point of view. My suspicion was that we were going to leave anyway, and that the left would have 50% of the country they would have nothing to tell them, which is what happened. So it's a work in progress, but people have autonomy on issues.
During the election, Novara came out in support of Jeremy Corbyn. How did you decide to do that? Because I've heard you talk about Corbyn long before when he tried to get elected, and you were like, is it going to work? But how did you decide? When did you decide during the campaign to fully back him as a candidate? And how was it received by your readers and your people? and how was it received by the Labour Party?
So obviously it was more of a curiosity at first. He needed to get 35 signatures to be on the ballot, and he got the last 2 signatures with like 30 seconds left. And John McDonnell was on his knees, praying, begging these MPs to write their names down. So history could be, very different. He got on the ballot. He was 200 to 1. So for us, it was more of a political curiosity. And the great thing about the Labour Party was that you didn't have to be a member. You could also register as a supporter, and you could still vote. So it was okay to still not be a full member and engage in the process. And as he became more and more likely to win, I interviewed him on the day that he actually became the favourite, which was a weird moment, because all of a sudden it had a different vibe. And he won, and I think most of the editorial team, by that time I was saying that, I want this guy to run the country, Most of the team disagreed because they didn't really think that he would A, last, or that B, a Labour government was likely, which is both fair points. Still hasn't happened, so they may be proven right. But gradually, I think, with the second leadership election, and then obviously with the general election, you can't not. And our initial audience, lots of anarchists, lots of people interested in identity politics, got very angry with that because they see that binary there. So we lost some of our initial audience, but we gained a much larger one. So.
And what do you think? Can you talk about a bit about the campaign and what you put into that when he was elected and during the election?
Yeah, the general election is the most interesting, I think, because in the first leadership race he was up against Yvette Cooper, Liz Kendall, Andy Burnham, who weren't very competent, right? And they didn't have the media behind them. The second leadership election he was against a guy called Owen Smith, who was terrible, was useless. He made a joke about having a 28-inch. Right? I mean, just ridiculous. Your jaw drops. How did this happen? How is this guy even a politician? And then, of course, in the general election, it's a very different proposal because you're up against the entire print media. On the day of voting in the general election, the Daily Mail had, I think, 16 pages dedicated. This is the second most read paper in the country. Had 16 pages calling Corbyn an IRA sympathiser, this, that and the other. So, yeah, what do we do in regards to that, I think, is interesting. Momentum. You guys have to get somebody over from Momentum. Their Facebook page was seen by a third of the British public during the general election. So their Facebook page, I think, was a better resource, more influential resource than any newspaper. They were doing viral video. They were breaking the divide between satire and politics. So a lot of people were watching these videos and they wouldn't even know that it was coming from an organisation favourable to Labour. It was just saying elites, establishment, Richard Branson playing golf and the person's holding the golf ball from their mouth and he's talking about, shareholder subsidies and privatisation. So there was lots of stuff like that, very, very powerful. And where we saw our role, because we're not as big as Momentum, was, again, about the ideas in people's heads. So we're almost like a hybrid think tank, hybrid media platform. So we were trying to debunk certain arguments and trying to make other ones. But it wasn't just to people online. We wanted the arguments that we were making to then be used by activists offline. So Britain's NHS is about 10% of GDP of our spending. The American healthcare system's 18%. And most people aren't covered. And more people die in childbirth in Bosnia than in the US, right? In the US than in Bosnia, sorry. So obviously the American system doesn't work, but people don't know that data. And so what we were doing is that's the sort of arguments we would be making, and then it's arming your activists, which is hundreds of thousands now, and they would be using that on the doorstep. And so it's a complex relationship.
Yeah, because I think that's one of the goals with the Flamman and our means to be more of have podcasts and video and live streaming and so forth. Is to change people's the activists' minds. So we want to gather the broad left to gather rather than just fight all the time, I think. But I think another interesting question about this, we have this right-wing media platforms from the extreme right here in Sweden, and we have had a discussion in Sweden about the left also doing that, just a populist or not a populist, but because that's a good word, but like an avpixlat for the left, and you have had similar discussions in Novara. Would you describe Novara as a populist project? And maybe you can tell the audience a bit about this Canary project that is that you talked about earlier in October, and if you think that the journalists or the left media should don't be so min engelska är verkligen förfärlig. Don't be so with the facts. Just don't. You know what.
So we've learned the hard way because we had Brexit.
Yeah.
Right. We had Brexit and then we saw Trump, and we learned a lesson. It's a good way of putting it. Is don't bring facts to an emotions fight. Yeah. It's like don't bring a knife to a gunfight, because the people are dealing in the emotions, and you bring these facts. Yeah. Well, actually, if we, the top 5% of earners, if we decrease that, people don't care about that. Right, and it's something that the Bernie people always said was that intuitively, the crisis, again, it's not the same in Sweden, but it will be, right? It will be. Because of ageing, because of climate change, because of resource scarcity, because of technological unemployment, it will be. They always said that people understand that problems are big, so we have to offer big solutions. And that's actually what gets people out to knock on doors. That's why hundreds of thousands of people got behind Jeremy Corbyn, because they were big solutions. It wasn't saying, we'll change tuition fees to a graduate tax. It was, we completely abolish fees. Everybody's going to be paid to go to university. We're going to look into even getting rid of the existing student debt. Right? We're going to bury the debt. So that's one part of it. It's popular because it's universal. And Social Democrats have given up on the principle of universalism in the last 20 years, mistakenly. But at the same time, rhetorically, it has to be populist. So, you can't use big words. Nothing wrong with big words. As a social scientist, you need to express stuff. If it's complicated stuff, it's going to require a complicated explanation. But when you're talking to the public, you have to speak in as an easy to understand form as possible. And the best way to do that is just to consistently repeat tropes. Just get it into people's heads. And when you do it at first, you feel kind of stupid. You feel like a 6-year-old. But if you just keep on going, rigged system, elite, rigged system. I mean, the US, they say 99%. If I'm going, I've not slept and my mind's going blank and I'm with a right-wing journalist, I'll go, rigged media. And, it just sounds bananas, but it resonates with most people. So you just continue with those tropes. And a great one, for the many, not the few, having these very easy to understand, we call them in the literature personalizable frames, because for the many not the few means something for you and it means something different for you, but both valuable and very hard to disagree with. So populist policies because they're universal. You could argue classically social democratic, and then populist and rhetoric. Yeah.
But as a media platform, are you a populist media platform?
Our podcasts are very difficult to understand. So we view that as we have concentric circles, okay? And the podcasts are very difficult to understand, very policy wonk, You'd have to be a graduate student really to understand them. But then a lot of the videos are very simple to understand. We've had videos which have 10, 15,000 shares, and a 6-year-old can understand them. So we try and basically, with videos and with written content, very easy to understand with podcasts, it's more about creating a broader debate within the left. So obviously it has to be more complex.
Finally, and I think maybe there's a bit questions from the audience after this, but finally, how would you describe the effect Novara Media has had on the media, and also on the political debate in general? Would you like to express something about that?
Yeah. So going back to the crisis in Britain, it's just ginormous. So when we've got, oh God, I go to Italy and they go, oh, the left's so much more interesting in Britain than Italy. Well, it's because it's kind of screwed in Britain, even more than Italy, and you guys are in the Eurozone. So there's a lot that's broken with our system. And 4 or 5 years ago, we were saying, we have mugs, and the logo says, no future, utopia now. Because there is no future under the system for our people. And I don't say our people like the Swedish Democrats, I mean people that live in those islands. There's no future. And what we've done in the last few years, I think, is basically persuade much of the mainstream left that this isn't a cyclical crisis, this is a secular crisis, and we have to respond accordingly. And I think now, the BBC is doing articles, what is capitalism for? They're having to engage with these, Theresa May gave a speech to the, I can't remember who it wasn't the Bank of England, and she said, we now have to defend market values. And we view our role as expanding the conversation as much as possible. So, for instance, my book is going to be it's about technology, and it's about the technologies of a different mode of production held back by the existing mode of production, post-capitalism and capitalism, and that's the kind of conversation we want to have. Or climate change. It's not about. I saw there's Arctic crisis and there's like a polar bear. The polar bears have already gone. They might as well be extinct. It's horrible to say, but they're gone. When we talk about climate change, we need to talk about hundreds of millions of climate refugees. Hundreds of millions, right? Or Southern Europe not being able to grow crops. Or Africa's population doubling at the precise moment that they can't grow maize. Or California having no water. This stuff will happen in a world of 2 degrees warming. So let's talk about that. So we're basically trying to get what are otherwise quite marginal debates aging. The budget's now saying we'll run a surplus in Britain in 2031. We won't, because we're ageing. Britain's never going to run a budget surplus ever again. Ever. Okay? So that's the conversation we're constantly trying to do, is to take quite mainstream conversations in a different direction.
And do you have any advice to, if you could give us some advice to Flamman or to the Swedish left, or to how would we, because you've been here since yesterday. I've tried to explain how the political situation is here, and that we try to we try to build something new here. What's your 3 best tips to a media platform such as ours?
Yeah. Well, actually, Milton Friedman said it. in the introduction to Capitalism and Freedom, he talks about the role of intellectuals, and he said they're most valuable in keeping certain ideas alive when they're at their lowest point. So even if you think, oh, the Social Democrats are going to win, Swedish rights on the rise, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell were nobodies for 25 years in the Houses of Parliament. But, sticking around matters, first and foremost. Don't give up. I'd say that's the big one. That's the role of intellectuals, to keep ideas alive when it feels like they're never going to go anywhere. I think Trotsky said it, it's impossible until it's inevitable. Which is true. It's true, with all social change. That would be my first one. My second one, in terms of fighting the far right, which is obviously your biggest issue here, is that they want to fight a culture war. Because in a sense, we won the culture war, We won the culture war. I've got 2 gay colleagues, I have a trans colleague, I'm mixed heritage, I have a colleague who's mixed heritage. That's not to say these problems have all gone. They haven't. But it's pretty clear who the victors were in the 1960s. So when you've got Milo Yiannopoulos, or you've got the Swedish Democrats, and they're giving you this stuff about immigration and so on and so forth, you have to look back at them and say, what are you doing for people whose wages are going down? Or they want to buy a home? Or they want their kids to have as good a standard of life as them? What are you going to do about growth not being what it was in the 1940s to 1960s? I'm very, very hesitant to go on that terrain because I think it's a hallmark of the fact, it's a symptom of the fact that conservatism no longer has an economics to offer. And now that neoliberalism is dying, they can't offer neoliberalism anymore. So I think mainstream conservatism will increasingly look like that. But that's a sign of their weakness, not their strength. No. So you can't ignore it, but I think always go on the material economic issues. And then thirdly, we call it, there's a guy called Mark Fisher, he calls it capitalist realism. You know this, the book? Capitalist realism. There's a great quote by Frederick Jameson. He says, it's harder to imagine the end of capitalism it's harder to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Okay? So, you have these disaster movies, and go, oh, that could really happen, yeah. An asteroid could hit Earth, or Children of Men, nobody has children anymore, or Terminator. Well, it could happen, right? But nobody thinks that you could have the end of a mode of production which is socially contingent. That's impossible. And, my friend puts it in a great way. You've got a Tory MP and they're saying we can't have a minimum wage of £10. And he says, there is a probe orbiting Mars, built by humans. Right now it's taking photos and it's sending them back to Earth. And you're telling me that people can't be paid £10 an hour? I mean, it's mad. So in Britain, I think we've smashed capitalist realism. And it sounds to me like because your version of capitalism is that much different to ours, it has more consent, more social democratic, that's going to be harder to break with. But it's not, the basis of this mode of production globally are gone now. There's no next China. Okay, so there's nowhere to relocate production. You have political issues, the Eurozone, again, the rise of the far right, climate change, technology. So the left needs radical ideas more than ever. And if that doesn't show up on this or that poll, don't worry about it. Stick with it. That'd be my advice.
And that's a very, very good way to end this discussion. And so I think we give Aaron a big round of applause. And then maybe there is someone who wants to ask a question. Yeah, many questions. That's very good. So I give this to them, and then you can answer in this one.
Thank you very much for a good talk. And first, a really quick question. Now, post-Brexit, are you still for Brexit? Post-Brexit?
Well, I mean, I've got no choice, have
I? Pardon?
I've got no choice. I mean, we're leaving, so...
Oh, yeah, of course. But do you feel like do you feel repent, or...?
Well, I voted Remain in the end, but I thought the intellectual argument was strongest for leave. Mm-hmm. But we have no choice. I certainly wouldn't be for a second referendum. I just think this is insane. Because why would that have any more legitimacy than the first vote? And we have this going on for 15 years. I don't want a civil war. So it's not perfect, but I think we can manage okay. I think we'll likely stay in the single market. I think ultimately.
Okay. My other question is that how do you feel? What is your opinion about Democracy in Europe movement by Yanis Varoufakis, for example? Since you mentioned you were for Corbyn and everything, since he was his advisor, so on also. And what is do you have any tips for the left in Sweden? Oh, referring to the euro.
Yeah. Okay, so start with. Should I just do that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that okay? So DM, I'm not very enthused by it. And the reason why is it's not very fashionable to say it, but the only repository of democratic accountability ever has been the nation state. I don't like nations. I want a borderless world, right? My dad was a refugee, but most people associate democracy with national legislatures. And the idea that all of a sudden we're going to have a European federal government, I think is just, I just don't see it. I don't see it. So I think it's, limited. That's not to say that we need massive European cooperation. We need to reform the World Bank, the IMF, the EU, of course. But I think fundamentally the main repository of decision-making will have to be the nation state. And then in terms of the euro, I mean, you shouldn't join it, right? Because I think the Italians are going to leave anyway. And when that happens, I mean, why? I mean, it's dead. Surely, it's the world's fourth biggest bond market. And I think, I mean, you go to Italy, they've got 200,000 people leaving every year. It's like they've had a war. You know, Greece's GDP is 20% lower than 2008. It's a war. So the strange thing with the crisis is it's playing out so slowly, right? It started in 2008, and we're almost 10 years in, and nobody's left the Eurozone yet. So maybe I'm talking nonsense. But my suspicion is that the Eurozone probably isn't resilient enough, unless it was reformed, but the Germans don't seem to want to do that.
Okay, we have a question here.
So, like you said, I really think we should have people from Momentum coming to Sweden for several reasons, and probably I should ask them in the first to begin with. But as someone who follows Momentum a lot, and also I watch some Novara Media videos, I'm thinking, about this media, this sphere of kind of social media videos and so on produced. Do you have any flow of personnel or ideas between, for example, the Momentum people? Are there even people, so to speak, work professionally with, for example, these satire videos, which I think are brilliant? Is there any flow between them and what you do, or are you independent?
Yeah, we are, sadly, which means that we keep on losing people. We're about to lose I fear we're about to lose our videographer to a certain politician who I won't name. We've lost our events guy, who now is the head of communications at Momentum. So this is the problem, is that any talent, they go elsewhere. So there is some flow, both in terms of personnel and ideas, yeah. And there's the World Transformed, which was this sort of parallel conference at Labour Party conference. And these are all very talented young kids. And the World Transformed has this power more than anybody else, because they all then become the staffers for these new MPs, or, you know. So there is a flow of people, but we always need more, yeah.
Okay. Take someone in the back as well. Here? No? Yeah.
Thanks for a good presentation. I'm wondering if you could briefly describe how you're working with distribution and what platforms you're at. You talked about podcasts and videos, but can you describe it a bit better and distribution part?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just use this. So primarily our video so far has been on Facebook in terms of reaching a massive audience. Facebook and Twitter. Actually, Facebook and Twitter. We've always put everything on YouTube as well, but it's increasingly clear that the cultural war is on YouTube for some reason. People will watch videos for hours on YouTube, so a lot of the ideological formation of the alt-right is on YouTube, not on Facebook. So if we're doing long-form ideological stuff, so an interview with David Harvey, right? 90 minutes, that's YouTube. But if it's 5 minutes satire or quick, it's Facebook. Or if it's 1 minute and you're trying to intervene in the mainstream media cycle, it's Twitter. Because Twitter doesn't reach a mass audience, but journalists are addicted. It's like cocaine for journalists. They can't get enough Twitter. So, I mean, if you're trying to influence an elite audience, Twitter's excellent, and video does very well there. And then in regard to podcasts, iTunes and SoundCloud. But the question of video and where you put it and what purposes you're trying to achieve is a really good question, actually.
Thank you for a great presentation. I have a question though regarding demographics, and if you would like to perhaps elaborate a bit on that and how you reached. Was it Momentum that brought the message of Novara Media to other demographics that you initially reached, or how did that work? Because I think that is also something in the Swedish context that is quite vital.
Again, it's about young people, and if you look at we had this guy doing the Bernie Sanders thing earlier on. If you look at, and he talked about the New Hampshire primary. I think in New Hampshire, Bernie beat Hillary Clinton by 6-1 amongst under 30s, and it's a similar tendency in Britain. Millennials, and it's a generational thing because it's going there was a certain crisis of capitalism, which means that it's historically situated. So some people can't access credit or jobs or capital that others can. So it's a younger audience for all of us because they have the grievances and also because they're more likely to use digital media. But at the same time, Labour is dying with older voters. And we have to be honest, Theresa May is still on 40%. And she's easily the worst Prime Minister, I think, of history. Easily,
Worse than Thatcher.
No, but in terms of, even John Major was like, there was a bit of presentation, there was a bit of tenacity. She can't even complete a speech, And the reason why is that older people just hate Corbynism. They hate it. The over 65s hate it. And so that's the big question now, is how do we win them over? And I don't think it's just policies. And then in terms of how we expanded our reach, I think it's about a certain moment. So like if you look at Breitbart, they did tremendously well in the sort of the slipstream of Trump. I think what will happen in this country is you'll have a general election. The Swedish Democrats are going to do phenomenally well. Fingers crossed, but they'll do better than they've done previously. And what you'll probably see is in their slipstream, some right-wing media outlets who will also do very well and expand their outlet. And they'll feed off one another, not just in terms of resources, but also legitimacy. So, the average person says, I'm voting Swedish Democrats because this seemingly legitimate news platform says that they're great. So the left will have to think in the same way. You're going to have to create media outlets and influencers who are in the slipstream, you hope, of a successful electoral moment. And that might not just be behind the left party, it might be behind the Greens. You could say, here's our problems we have with X, Y, and Z. You have to be relevant. It was like the birdie thing. They had to do it in those 3 days. That's what you're going to have to do in a general election context. Every day for 6 weeks, you have to stay, get in that slipstream. And that's how you get a really big audience.
Okej, en till fråga. Vi tar längst ner där.
Thank you for your presentation. So my question is this relationship between content and form. So we have in the United States, we have this democracy now, and the limitation to that model is you have these talking heads, and they're often saying things are bad, which you can read the New York Times for. You don't need left media for that.
Yeah.
And we suffer from a similar disease like that in this country. We have left media, Aftonbladet and this one and that one, and they're also very much involved in deconstruction. And I think one of the problems has been that you can live by celebrities and die by celebrities. You have the celebrity leftists who are taking up the space. I've been at an event here where one of these celebrity leftists, who's supposedly one of the leading Marxist intellectuals, said, Marxists should not study the media. All right.
Marx wrote for the New York Tribune. And that's crazy.
Hey, look, don't shoot the messenger. I did a write-up and explain the limitation of that. So I'm getting to a question. The question is threefold. One, I think in some of the original models of media influence, this Katz and I forgot the other one, they talked about a two-step thing where you need to have some face-to-face interaction. So classical Greek democracy, I forgot the name of the guy, the famous situationist, he said that democracy is based on critical education. So, how can we combine the face-to-face thing with the media thing? Because I think a lot of leftists say, I'm just going to use Twitter.
Yeah.
You have audiences who don't have the cultural capital, so that's the first point that you could respond. Then the second thing is, we don't really have a media accountability system in this country. We had a whole episode, 2 weeks, advertisement for the military-industrial complex with a submarine that looked like a golf club in the photograph in the newspaper, sticking out of the water. And nobody in the left could do anything. They gave this Göran Greider 10 minutes to rebut 2 weeks of solid coverage. So I'm wondering if you could build that kind of structure in Britain and what lesson that might have for the U.S. And then the final thing is Bertolt Brecht had the idea of media that people would actually be involved and you could create a public space, not just leftist intellectuals depositing information in Ferrari injecting knowledge into people, but to actually give them a platform that's relatively open. And I'm wondering if we can do that with the left media, because a lot of these intellectuals, as I said at the beginning, they're just deconstructing things. They offer people absolutely no vision, no sense of alternative, no sense of choices.
Yeah, really good. Wish I had a pen, but you'll have to prompt me. I'll answer the first one, and then you have to prompt me for each one.
I'm an academic, so I go on and on.
No, it's good. They're all good questions. So the first one you were saying about offline interaction. You know, in 2009, this is my area, 2009, Malcolm Gladwell was talking about, you know, for collective action, you need strong ties, but online media creates weak ties, so it's not good enough. And then obviously everything since then has kind of disproved that. We have, clearly digital media has a big influence on politics, whether it's Trump, whether it's the 15M in Spain, whether it's Brexit. Clearly digital media has a big role to play. We're unsure how and to what effect, but it does. So how does it interact with the offline stuff? There was a great bit of, I think it was a survey by Karl Rove in 2006, and he said the best way to predict somebody's voting intention as a Republican or Democrat is whether they've had two people they admire, friends or family, tell them to vote for this person. And he said that was more valuable than any print media, TV, anything. And this was the power of Corbynism, is that you had a lot of people who were willing to say, I don't care what the TV says, what print says, this is my guy. And they were very loud about it. And when you've got a party of 500,000 people, you know, those are the people making the recommendations. And I was watching a BBC focus group, and there was even a guy there saying, I'm going to vote Corbyn. I voted Lib Dem. Why? There's these two guys at work, they always bang on about it. And, you know, it seems to make sense. And that was holding true for a lot of people. So the digital media feeds into the offline. And I think, you know, that's part of the plan, what we have. And then secondly, you were saying about you live and die by media capital.
Celebrity.
Yeah, but they have, you know, let's say 25 million Twitter followers or whatever, right? I mean, David Beckham, the day before Brexit, said, vote Remain, right? And just nobody was listening. You know, nobody was listening. So that spelled to an extent, or take the US. The entire celebrity establishment in the US really was aligned with Hillary. But it didn't have that big an effect. I'm not saying it's irrelevant, it's not irrelevant, but it's not as influential as it was a couple of decades ago, certainly. So I agree with you. It doesn't mean you have to be ambivalent towards celebrities, but yeah, you don't need them. And in terms of leftist celebrities, I'm very ambivalent about leftist celebrities. That said, if we do an event with Owen Jones, you know, or if I go to a nightclub and Owen's there, and I go, hey, do you want a drink? You know, and he'll be 30 meters away. He has to walk like this, shaking hands, and about 2 hours later he gets to the bar. So obviously he's a celebrity, right? But I think generally speaking, that's probably quite unhealthy as a culture. But I think if we are moving as a society of one that was, you know, the society of spectacle, broadcast media, then clearly those forms are going to reproduce themselves. But I don't think it's as bad as it could be. And for me, the reason why Corbyn and Sanders are so successful is that they don't represent that, right? There's a certain genre of authenticity where people say this person isn't telegenic, this person isn't, you know, smooth. They're real, and they're consistent, as the speaker said, you know, a few hours ago, and they respect that. And then in terms of the left intellectuals, you're saying deconstructing. You're entirely right. You know, you need to offer, and this is, for me, it's the value of utopianism. You need to offer a utopia to people. That doesn't mean you say we're going to eliminate poverty, everybody's going to have everything. But, you know, you need to say things like, well, why can't we take housing and transport in Britain, out of commodification, you know? Why don't we, again, it's about the big ideas, make education completely free? So you need those big, appealing, quasi-utopian frames on the left. Because if you haven't got them, then you're lost. Again, that's one of the limits, I think, of social democratic politics the last 20 years.
Yes, and now it's time to runda upp saker och ting. Ja, min engelska. I have a gift for you, Aaron. It's a t-shirt like this one. It says, we have cured political depression since 1906. And it's a bag and it's a t-shirt. So thank you very much for joining us today. And we hope that me and my people can go to London and visit you as well.
When we've won power, come down. We'll give some foreign loans. The big skyscraper for Flamman.
That's a great idea. So thank you very much for coming to this event, and don't forget to buy a subscription to Flamman. Thank you.